"Humans are insects," Gorthel hissed, his voice guttural and sharp. "That's what they are. Crawling, frightened insects." The gathered Gyrax officers remained silent. They had seen the general's rage before, and none dared interrupt him when he spoke of his prey. Gorthel's clawed hand hovered over a holographic projection of Earth. His sharp fingers curled into a fist, crushing the image into fragments of light. "Cowards," he continued, his tone laced with contempt. "They hide behind diplomacy and false civility, trembling at the thought of war. Let them hear this clearly. Submit or be eradicated. Their fear will guide them to the only logical choice." He turned to a subordinate, a younger Gyrax officer whose spines bristled nervously. "Send the broadcast. Let their leaders quake as they listen to my terms." The officer bowed and scuttled to carry out the order. Within minutes, every human communication network flickered to life with the image of General Gorthel. His jagged features filled the screen, his voice distorted yet powerful as it echoed across Earth. "Humans," he snarled, "you are weak, insignificant. Your species exists only because we have not deemed it worthy of extermination until now. Surrender your planet to the Gyrax Empire, or we will burn it to ash. You have 48 hours. Across Earth, panic erupted. Broadcasts were interrupted. Debates dissolved into chaos, and streets filled with fearful murmurs. In the high-security chambers of the United Nations Security Council, the atmosphere was no different. Diplomats and military officials argued over what course of action to take, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of desperation. Even our most advanced fleets wouldn't last an hour against them. One diplomat shouted, his face pale. "We can't just surrender. We'd be condemning billions to slavery, or worse," countered another. At the head of the table, General Victor Langston slammed his fist down, silencing the room. His grizzled features betrayed no emotion, but his voice carried the weight of experience. "This isn't the time for panic," Langston said firmly. "It's the time for action." "And what action do you propose, General?" a representative from Europe asked, her tone skeptical. "Throw everything we have at them and hope for the best? That's suicide." Langston's gaze swept across the room. "No," he said slowly. "We send one man." The room erupted again, disbelief washing over the gathered officials. Langston let them vent for a moment before raising his voice. "You've all heard of James Keith," he said, his tone commanding attention. The name silenced the room, rippling through the air like an unspoken truth. "Keith," one official finally said, "you can't be serious. He's just one man." "One man," Langston repeated, leaning forward, "who's accomplished more in his career than entire battalions. You think he's just a soldier? He's a weapon, and he's exactly what we need right now." Murmurs filled the room, doubt mixing with reluctant intrigue. Langston didn't wait for further objections. He gestured to an aide, who pressed a button on a console. A holographic screen materialized, displaying classified footage of James Keith in action. The room watched in silence as Keith, clad in black tactical gear, moved like a shadow through hostile territory. His precision was surgical, his movements almost inhumanly efficient. Enemy soldiers fell before they even realized he was there. "He's a ghost," Langston said, his voice quieter now. "A phantom who survived missions no one else could. If anyone can infiltrate that fleet and take out General Gorthel, it's him." Still, doubt lingered in the air. "And if he fails?" someone asked. Langston's jaw tightened. "Then we're out of options anyway." Miles away, in the Nevada desert, the man in question was oblivious to the storm brewing in the world's highest offices. James Keith stood alone in a private hangar, the vast emptiness around him mirroring the silence he carried within. His frame was lean but powerful, his movements calculated and deliberate. A faint scar traced the edge of his jaw, a reminder of a mission long past. His piercing green eyes scanned the array of weapons laid out before him, though his mind was elsewhere. The soft hum of an approaching vehicle broke his concentration. Keith turned as a black SUV rolled to a stop, and General Langston stepped out. Keith, Langston greeted, his tone businesslike but tinged with respect. General, Keith replied, his voice low and steady. Langston wasted no time. We've got a situation. A big one. Keith raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for the general to continue. Langston handed him a data tablet, its screen glowing with images of the Gyrax fleet and a playback of Gorthal's broadcast. They're giving us 48 hours to surrender, Langston said. And we both know that's not an option. Keith studied the tablet in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he set it down and looked at Langston. And you want me to go in alone? Langston nodded. Infiltrate the flagship, take out their general, and destabilize their chain of command. If we can eliminate Gorthal, there's a chance the rest of their fleet will pull back. Keith considered this for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. It's a suicide mission. Maybe, Langston admitted. But if anyone can pull it off, it's you. For a long moment, Keith didn't respond. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, he said, "When do I leave?" Langston allowed himself a rare smile. Soon. Very soon. As the general departed, Keith turned back to the hangar. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights above seemed to grow louder in the quiet. He picked up a combat knife, its blade gleaming under the artificial light, and slid it into a sheath on his belt. Alone once more, Keith allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He thought of the missions that had brought him here, the lives he had saved and the lives he hadn't. Each scar on his body was a story, and each story a reminder of the weight he carried. But there was no time for regrets now. The enemy was coming, and humanity's survival rested on his shoulders. The night before the mission was still and heavy, as if the entire world held its breath. In the sterile confines of the launch facility, James Keith stood motionless as a team of engineers fitted him with the advanced infiltration suit that would be his only shield against the alien fleet. The suit clung to his body like a second skin, matte black with intricate circuits that pulsed faintly as they calibrated to his movements. Its design was cutting-edge, developed specifically for stealth in alien environments, but Keith regarded it with indifference. To him, it was just another tool, one more piece in the puzzle of survival. General Langston observed from a distance, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "How does it feel?" he asked, breaking the silence. Keith flexed his fingers, the suit responding seamlessly. "Like it's part of me," he said, his tone neutral. Langston nodded, stepping closer. "This isn't just about technology, Keith. You're walking into the lion's den. You'll be on your own out there. No backup, no rescue, just you and them." Keith's gaze shifted to the window overlooking the hangar. Beyond the reinforced glass, his shuttle gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a compact, streamlined vessel designed for one purpose: to get in undetected. "I've been alone before," Keith said quietly. Langston studied him for a moment, his weathered features softening. "This is different," he said. "You're not just fighting for yourself this time. You're fighting for all of us." Keith didn't respond, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. The weight of Langston's words settled on him, though he wore it like armor. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. He had been trained to focus on the mission, to push everything else aside. The engineers finished their work and stepped back, their faces a mix of awe and unease. Keith turned to Langston, his voice steady. "What's the plan?" Langston handed him a sleek tablet. The screen displayed a rotating 3D model of the Gyrax flagship. "You'll approach under the cover of the ship's shadow. The stealth systems on your shuttle should keep you invisible to their sensors, but you'll need to navigate through their drone patrols manually. Once you're aboard, your priority is locating General Gorthal. He'll be in the command center, near the core of the ship." Keith nodded, his eyes scanning the detailed schematics. He committed them to memory with the same methodical precision that had kept him alive in countless missions. "And the exit plan?" he asked. Langston hesitated. "Get to the shuttle if you can. If not," he let the sentence trail off. Keith didn't need him to finish. He understood what wasn't being said. If things went south, there would be no extraction. This was a one-way ticket. Hours later, as the countdown to launch began, Keith sat in the cockpit of the shuttle, his hands resting lightly on the controls. The interior was cramped, filled with the faint hum of advanced systems booting up around him. Outside, the hangar doors groaned open, revealing the endless void of space. Langston's voice crackled over the comms. "Keith, this is it. You clear on the mission parameters." "Crystal," Keith replied, his voice calm. There was a pause, and then Langston said, "Good luck, soldier. The world's counting on you." The connection cut off, leaving Keith alone with the hum of the engines and the faint tremor of anticipation in his chest. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself. Fear had no place here. Fear was the enemy. The shuttle lifted off with a whisper, its advanced propulsion systems designed for silence. Keith guided it out of the hangar and into the darkness, the earth shrinking behind him until it was just a distant blue speck. Ahead, the Gyrax fleet stretched across the void like a living wall, their ships bristling with weapons and patrol drones that moved in eerie, synchronized patterns. Keith's hands tightened on the controls as he approached the fleet's perimeter. The shuttle stealth systems activated, cloaking him in a field of electromagnetic distortion. The sensors on the dashboard showed the drones circling nearby, their movements erratic and predatory. He maneuvered carefully, threading the shuttle through the gaps in their patrol routes. Each second stretched into an eternity as the drones passed dangerously close, their sleek forms glinting in the faint light of distant stars. Keith's heartbeat remained steady, his breathing measured. He had done this before, though never against an enemy like this. When he finally reached the shadow of the flagship, he guided the shuttle into a small maintenance port, barely large enough to fit. The craft hissed as it docked, the interior lights dimming. Keith rose from the cockpit, his movements fluid and precise. He grabbed his weapons, compact, lethal designs engineered for maximum efficiency, and secured them to his suit. The airlock hissed open, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in the sickly green glow of alien lighting. Keith stepped out, his boots making no sound against the metallic floor. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive, and the faint hum of alien machinery resonated through the walls. He moved like a shadow, his every step calculated. The corridor twisted and branched, a labyrinth of unfamiliar architecture. Keith's visor displayed a map of the ship's layout, guiding him toward the command center. He encountered his first obstacle minutes later, a pair of Gyrax soldiers patrolling the corridor. Their movements were rigid, their insectoid features as alien as their surroundings. Keith pressed himself against the wall, watching them pass. He waited until they were out of sight before slipping forward, his presence undetected. As he advanced deeper into the ship, Keith's mind sharpened, every detail around him amplified. The Gyrax technology was unlike anything he'd seen before, organic and mechanical elements fused seamlessly, the walls pulsing faintly as if alive. He reached a junction where two more guards stood, their weapons glowing faintly with energy. Keith crouched low, calculating his approach. With practiced precision, he deployed a small, silent drone from his wrist. It hovered briefly before darting toward the guards, emitting a faint pulse that disrupted their neural pathways. They crumpled to the floor, unconscious before they could react. Keith moved past them, his focus unbroken. Every step brought him closer to the heart of the ship, to the general who had threatened humanity with annihilation. But as he continued, a flicker of doubt crept into his mind, a question he had buried deep but could not ignore. What if this wasn't enough? What if even killing Gorthel wouldn't stop the fleet? He shook the thought away. That wasn't his concern. His mission was clear, and he would see it through. As he approached the final section of the ship before the command center, Keith paused. He leaned against the wall, his breathing controlled, his mind focused. This was a calm before the storm, the moment of stillness before everything erupted into chaos. For a fleeting second, he thought of Earth, of the people depending on him, of the life he had left behind. He allowed himself one deep breath, then pushed the thought aside. Drawing his weapon, Keith stepped into the next corridor, the faint echo of his movements swallowed by the oppressive silence. Somewhere ahead, General Gorthel waited, and Keith was ready. The air in the Gyrax command center was suffocating, thick with the metallic tang of alien machinery and the distant hum of energy conduits. James Keith moved through the corridors like a phantom, his form blending seamlessly with the shadows. Every sound, every movement was calculated, his training honed to perfection in the crucible of countless battles. But this mission was unlike any he had faced before. The stakes had never been so high, and the enemy had never been so alien. Ahead, the corridor opened into a wide chamber, the walls pulsing faintly with an organic rhythm, as though the ship itself were alive. Keith crouched behind a bulkhead, his visor scanning the room. 4 Gyrax soldiers stood guard, their insectoid form silhouetted against the green glow of the central command console. Their mandibles clicked intermittently, their movements precise and unerringly synchronized. Keith's mind raced. He needed to get past them without triggering an alarm. Reaching for the small drone mounted on his wrist, he activated it with a silent command. The device detached and hovered, a tiny, unassuming speck against the backdrop of alien machinery. It drifted toward the guards, emitting a faint, imperceptible frequency. Within seconds, the guards stiffened, their compound eyes flickering erratically. One by one, they collapsed, their neural pathways overloaded by the drone's interference. Keith moved quickly, slipping into the room before the guards could recover. The central console loomed before him, a chaotic array of alien symbols and pulsating nodes. Keith pulled a small device from his belt, a universal translator interface with hacking protocols developed by Earth's brightest minds. He attached it to the console, watching as the alien symbols morph into something intelligible. His eyes scanned the information rapidly. The command center was just beyond the next chamber, heavily guarded and shielded by layers of energy fields. General Gorthel would be there, overseeing the fleet's operations. But Keith knew getting to him wouldn't be as simple as slipping through corridors unnoticed. The ship's defenses were tightening, the guards more numerous and alert the deeper he went. A faint vibration in the floor jolted him from his focus. Keith turned sharply, his instincts flaring. The guards he had incapacitated were stirring, their limbs twitching as they struggled to regain control. He didn't have much time. Detaching the translator, Keith moved swiftly toward the exit. He slipped into another corridor just as an alarm began to wail, the sound shrill and piercing. The Gyrax had detected the breach. The walls of the ship seemed to vibrate with life as the alarm echoed through its corridors. Keith broke into a controlled sprint, his suit absorbing the sound of his footsteps. Behind him, the clatter of Gyrax soldiers grew louder. Their voices were sharp and guttural, a language that carried both urgency and rage. Keith reached an intersection and ducked into an alcove, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. He activated the tactical map on his visor, recalibrating his route. The Gyrax were closing in, but he still had a path forward. As he rounded a corner, he encountered a squad of soldiers blocking his way. Their energy weapons glowed ominously, and their compound eyes locked onto him with predatory precision. Keith reacted instantly, drawing his sidearm and firing 2 shots in rapid succession. The weapon's silencer ensured the blasts were nearly inaudible, but the effects were devastating. 2 soldiers fell, their chitinous armor no match for the specialized rounds. The remaining soldiers charged, their movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. Keith ducked under a swinging blade-like appendage, his combat knife flashing as he countered. The blade sank into the weak point between the soldier's neck and shoulder, and it crumpled with a guttural hiss. The final Gyrax lunged, its clawed hands swiping dangerously close. Keith rolled to the side, his movements a blur of precision. He fired another shot, the soldier collapsing in a heap. The corridor fell silent once more, save for the distant echoes of approaching reinforcements. Keith didn't linger. He moved forward, his mind focused on the objective. Each encounter drained precious time, and he knew the Gyrax would only grow more relentless. He reached the final barrier, a massive, circular door reinforced with layers of alien technology. The command center lay beyond it, but the energy shield guarding the door crackled ominously. Keith studied it for a moment, his mind calculating the best approach. From his belt, he retrieved a small EMP device, a prototype designed for missions like this. Placing it against the wall near the energy conduit, he activated the timer and stepped back. The device emitted a high-pitched whine, building to a crescendo before discharging a pulse of electromagnetic energy. The shield flickered and died, and Keith wasted no time. He approached the door, overriding its controls with the hacking tool. The massive structure groaned as it slid open, revealing the heart of the Gyrax flagship. The command center was vast and otherworldly, a chaotic blend of organic and mechanical elements. The walls pulsated with faint light, and the air was thick with the hum of alien machinery. At the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of holographic displays, stood General Gorthel. The Gyrax leader was even more imposing in person, his towering form radiating menace. His carapace gleamed under the green light, and his multifaceted eyes glinted with cruel intelligence. When he spoke, his voice was a deep, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "So," Gorthel said, his mandibles clicking in what could only be described as amusement, "the humans sent a single warrior to challenge the might of the Gyrax Empire. How quaint." Keith stepped forward, his weapon trained on the general. "Surrender," he said simply. Gorthel laughed, the sound sharp and grating. "You misunderstand, human. This is not a negotiation. You have walked willingly into your own death." At his signal, more Gyrax soldiers poured into the room, their weapons trained on Keith. The human remained calm, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he had come too far to fail now. Keith activated the final protocol in his suit, a last resort measure designed for situations just like this. The suit system surged, and his body seemed to blur as the nanotechnology enhanced his movements to superhuman levels. The Gyrax soldiers fired, but Keith was already moving. He darted between them with inhuman speed, his weapons a flurry of controlled destruction. Energy blasts lit up the room, but none found their mark. One by one, the soldiers fell, their precision no match for Keith's relentless assault. The general watched with growing fury, his mandibles clicking in agitation. When the last soldier fell, Keith turned to Gorthel. The room was silent now, save for the hum of the ship systems. "Your empire dies with you," Keith said, his voice cold. Gorthel roared, his massive form charging at Keith with terrifying speed. The two collided in a whirlwind of violence, the human's precision clashing with the general's raw strength. The battle was brutal, each strike resonating with the weight of their respective worlds. Keith fought with everything he had, his body pushed to its absolute limits. As Gorthel loomed over him, Keith saw his opportunity, a weak point in the general's carapace just above his chest. Summoning the last of his strength, he drove his blade upward, the weapon sinking deep into the alien's core. Gorthel staggered, his massive form collapsing to the ground. His mandibles clicked weakly as he glared at Keith, his multifaceted eyes dimming. "This is not the end," Gorthel hissed, his voice fading. Keith stepped back, his breathing heavy. The general's body lay still, the room falling into an eerie silence. But the mission was far from over. The fleet still surrounded Earth, and Keith knew the hardest part was yet to come. He activated his comms, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his body. "Langston, Gorthel is down. What's my next move?" The reply crackled through the static, carrying with it a sense of urgency. "Keith, we've got a problem. The fleet isn't retreating. You need to." The transmission cut off, leaving Keith alone in the alien silence. The rising action had reached its peak, but the endgame was just beginning. The room trembled as a low, guttural hum coursed through the walls, signaling the Gyrax flagship's awakening to Keith's presence. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a living fortress, and its defenses had turned inward, targeting the lone human standing amidst the wreckage of its fallen general. Keith wiped a streak of alien blood from his visor, his breathing ragged, his muscles burned, but his mind was as sharp as ever, processing every detail with machine-like precision. General Gorthal's lifeless body lay at Keith's feet, but the victory felt hollow. The fleet remained, an immovable wall of destruction surrounding Earth. Keith's comms remained silent, either jammed or destroyed, leaving him with no guidance, no reassurance that his sacrifice would mean anything. Yet he stood firm, his resolve hardening with every passing second. This was his fight. Alone or not, he would finish it. A sudden, deafening roar echoed through the chamber, followed by the mechanical grinding of the ship's core systems activating. Holographic displays flickered to life, bathing the room in a sickly green glow. Symbols scrolled across the screens faster than Keith could process, but the message was clear. The Gyrax flagship was initiating its final assault. Earth's time was running out. Keith's eyes darted to the central console, its interface pulsating with alien energy. His mind raced. The general was dead, but the ship was still operational, its systems likely routed through redundant fail-safes. If he could override the controls, he might be able to disable the fleet, or at the very least, delay the attack. He sprinted to the console, his boots pounding against the organic metal floor. The interface resisted his initial attempts, the alien system rejecting his Earth-made hacking tool. Keith growled in frustration, his fingers working furiously. The Gyrax technology was unlike anything he had faced before, adaptive, intelligent, and maddeningly complex. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his voice tinged with desperation. "There's got to be a way in." A sudden jolt of pain shot through his side as an energy blast grazed him, searing through his suit. Keith spun, his weapon already drawn, and fired at the source of the attack. A Gyrax soldier, larger and more heavily armored than the ones he had faced before, charged at him with a guttural snarl. Keith dodged the first strike, his enhanced reflexes barely keeping him ahead of the alien's relentless assault. The soldier swung a massive, blade-like appendage, slicing through the air with deadly precision. Keith countered with a swift roll, firing a burst of rounds into the soldier's exposed flank. The alien roared in pain but didn't falter, its rage fueling its attacks. The fight was brutal, every movement a test of Keith's skill and endurance. He fought like a man possessed, his mind and body working in perfect harmony. Finally, with a calculated strike, he drove his combat knife into the soldier's neck, severing its spinal cord. The alien collapsed with a final, shuddering breath. Keith didn't waste a moment. He turned back to the console, his hands trembling from exertion. The hacking tool finally broke through the system's defenses, and the alien symbols began to translate into something readable. Keith's eyes scanned the data, searching for anything that could turn the tide. There it was, the fleet's central command signal, a pulsating frequency emanating from the flagship. If he could disrupt it, he might be able to disable the entire fleet. But doing so would require overloading the ship's core, a move that would almost certainly destroy the vessel and everything on it. Keith hesitated for only a fraction of a second. He had known from the start that this mission was a one-way trip. He input the sequence, his fingers steady despite the weight of his decision. The console began to glow brighter, the ship's systems protesting as he forced them into a cascade failure. The room shook violently, the walls groaning under the strain. Keith stumbled but caught himself, his eyes fixed on the console. The core's overload process had begun, and the countdown timer flashed ominously. 3 minutes. A sudden voice broke through the static in his comms, faint but unmistakable. "Keith, are you there?" It was Langston. The general's voice was strained, filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm here," Keith replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "What's your status?" Langston asked. "I've initiated a core overload," Keith said. "The flagship's going down and the fleet with it. But I won't make it out." There was a long pause, the weight of Keith's words sinking in. When Langston spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "You've done enough, soldier. You've saved us all." Keith allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Just doing my job." The connection cut out again. The comms overwhelmed by the escalating energy surges. Keith took a deep breath, steadying himself. The Gyrax flagship trembled around him, the ship's death throes growing more violent by the second. With less than a minute remaining, Keith made his way to the central viewport. He stood there, his battered body silhouetted against a vast expanse of space. In the distance, Earth glowed like a fragile jewel, a reminder of everything he was fighting for. As the countdown reached its final moments, Keith closed his eyes. He thought of the people he had protected, of the lives that would go on because of his sacrifice. He thought of the planet that had shaped him, the home he had given everything to defend. The explosion was blinding, a massive burst of energy that consumed the flagship in an instant. The shockwave rippled through the Gyrax fleet, the cascading disruption shutting down their ships one by one. The once imposing armada was left adrift, powerless and defeated. On Earth, the skies lit up with the brilliance of the explosion, a beacon of humanity's triumph. Crowds gathered in streets and fields, their cheers and tears mingling as they realized the threat was over. In the command center, General Langston stood silent, his gaze fixed on the screen showing the remnants of the Gyrax fleet. Around him, the room erupted into celebration, but Langston couldn't bring himself to join in. "He did it," one of the officers said, their voice filled with awe. Langston nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. "He did," he said quietly. James Keith's name would be remembered, etched into the annals of history as the man who stood alone against an empire and prevailed. But for Langston and for those who had known him, it was a bittersweet victory. Keith had given everything, not for glory or recognition, but because it was what needed to be done. He had been a soldier to the very end, a beacon of humanity's resilience and courage. As the dust settled and Earth began to heal, Keith's sacrifice became a symbol, a reminder that even in the face of insurmountable odds, humanity could endure. The legend of James Keith lived on, a testament to the strength of the human spirit.